My name is Gideon Thatcher. I am 43 years old, and I've worked volcanic monitoring for the United States Geological Survey for 16 years, specializing in seismic surveillance of Mount Rainier, an active stratovolcano in Washington's Cascade Mountains, and one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the United States due to its massive glacial system and proximity to major population centers. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. Mount Rainier stands 14,411 feet and is covered by 25 major glaciers containing more glacial ice than all other Cascade volcanoes combined. The mountain is classified as a decade volcano due to its history of large lahars and proximity to the Seattle-Tacoma metropolitan area. USGS maintains continuous seismic monitoring through a network of stations positioned around the volcano to detect any signs of increased volcanic activity. My work involves overnight shifts at the Cascades Volcano Observatory Monitoring Station, analyzing real-time seismic data from instruments positioned at various elevations on Mount Rainier. These stations measure ground movement, detect earthquakes, and provide early warning of potential volcanic activity or glacier instabilities that could trigger catastrophic lahars. This happened last March during a routine overnight monitoring shift. I reported to the observatory around 10 p.m., relieving the day shift seismologist and beginning standard protocols for overnight volcanic surveillance. Weather conditions showed a winter storm system moving through the Cascades with heavy snow above 6,000 feet elevation around 2:30 am. While reviewing seismic data from stations positioned on Mount Rainier's upper slopes, I noticed something that shouldn't be possible according to volcanic monitoring protocols and atmospheric physics. All seismic stations above 10,000 feet elevation were simultaneously recording atmospheric pressure readings that violated fundamental principles of how air pressure changes with altitude. Atmospheric pressure decreases predictably with elevation, standard physics that has been measured and verified for centuries. At sea level, normal atmospheric pressure is approximately 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 10,000 feet, it should be roughly 10 pounds per square inch. At 14,000 feet, near Rainier's summit, approximately 8.3 pounds per square inch. But my monitoring equipment was showing atmospheric pressure at 10,000 feet matching sea level pressure, 14.7 pounds per square inch. Stations at 12,000 feet showed the same reading. Summit instruments at 14,411 feet were recording atmospheric pressure identical to sea level conditions. I've worked volcanic monitoring for 16 years across multiple Cascade volcanoes. I understand atmospheric physics, instrument calibration, and data quality control. What I was observing defied fundamental laws governing how Earth's atmosphere behaves with altitude changes. I immediately checked instrument calibration across all high elevation stations. Every system showed proper function. I reviewed historical data to verify this wasn't recurring equipment malfunction. Previous 24 hours showed normal atmospheric pressure gradients consistent with elevation changes. The impossible pressure readings persisted for 43 minutes. During that time, all seismic stations above 10,000 feet recorded sea level atmospheric pressure, while stations below 10,000 feet showed normal pressure gradients appropriate for their elevations. There was a distinct boundary at exactly 10,000 feet where atmospheric physics operated normally below but violated fundamental principles above. Then at 3:13 am, atmospheric pressure readings returned to normal across all elevations. Stations at 10,000 feet showed appropriate 10 psi readings. Summit instruments returned to expected 8.3 psi measurements. The pressure gradient resumed normal behavior consistent with altitude changes. I documented everything and filed detailed reports with USGS volcanic monitoring supervisors. The data was irrefutable. For 43 minutes, atmospheric pressure above 10,000 feet on Mount Rainier had behaved impossibly, showing sea level conditions at elevations where air should be significantly thinner. USGS brought in atmospheric physicists and instrument engineers to review the data. They confirmed my observations, but had no explanation. The equipment had functioned properly. The data was valid. But the recorded atmospheric conditions violated physics that governs how Earth's atmosphere behaves at different elevations. What concerned scientists most was the precision of the boundary. Exactly at 10,000 feet, normal atmospheric physics resumed. Above that elevation, physics had temporarily operated by different rules. The boundary was so precise it couldn't be explained by any known atmospheric phenomena or equipment error. I contacted other volcanic monitoring seismologists working Cascade volcanoes, including Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, and Mount Baker. Two admitted they'd observed brief periods of unusual atmospheric pressure readings at high elevation monitoring stations. Minutes where pressure measurements didn't match expected values for station elevations. Instances where atmospheric physics seemed temporarily altered at specific altitude thresholds. Zone seismologist from Mount St. Helens described a night when all stations above 8,000 feet simultaneously recorded atmospheric pressure increases that would require air density impossible at those elevations. Another monitoring specialist from Mount Baker reported high elevation stations showing pressure readings, suggesting the summit was at sea level for approximately 20 minutes before returning to normal. The indigenous peoples of the Cascade Mountains, including the Puyallup and Nisqually tribes for whom Mount Rainier, Tahoma, in their languages hold sacred significance, have traditional knowledge about the mountain. According to their teachings, Tahoma is a living presence that sometimes alters conditions on its upper slopes in ways that challenge human understanding of how mountains and atmosphere interact. They say when the mountain changes its atmosphere, it is demonstrating that natural laws humans consider fixed can be temporarily suspended in places of great power. I continue volcanic monitoring work at Mount Rainier because early detection of volcanic activity is essential for public safety given the mountain's proximity to major population centers. But I am different now during those overnight hours alone, monitoring seismic data from high elevation stations when atmospheric pressure readings show sea level conditions at 14,000 feet elevation, when fundamental physics governing air pressure and altitude temporarily cease operating above specific elevation thresholds, when instruments record valid data that violates atmospheric principles verified by centuries of measurement. I document everything thoroughly, and I understand that Mount Rainier, despite being one of the most extensively monitored volcanoes in the world, has the ability to temporarily alter atmospheric physics on its upper slopes in ways that challenge our understanding of how Earth's atmosphere must behave. That the mountain can create conditions where air pressure doesn't decrease with elevation, where sea level atmospheric density exists at high altitude, demonstrating through impossible but valid measurements that volcanic mountains may possess capabilities to locally suspend normal physical laws governing atmospheric behavior. Mount Rainier contains 25 major glaciers and reaches over 14,000 feet elevation, creating extreme environments where atmospheric conditions are constantly measured through sophisticated monitoring networks. Perfect location for temporary physics violations that challenge fundamental understanding of atmosphere and elevation. And based on what I documented that March night and subsequent reports from other Cascade volcano monitors, something does exist within or around Mount Rainier that can temporarily alter atmospheric pressure behavior above specific elevations that creates conditions where normal altitude pressure relationships cease operating, and that demonstrate D through 43 minutes of impossible but valid data that volcanic mountains in the Cascades may have abilities to locally modify atmospheric physics in ways that reveal natural laws we consider absolute might be conditionally suspended in locations of geological power and sacred significance. My name is Ambrose Whitfield. I am 39 years old, and I've worked trail infrastructure maintenance for North Cascades National Park for 11 years, specializing in overnight structural inspections of remote wilderness trail bridges. Some of the most isolated and challenging bridge structures maintained by the National Park Service. This happened last August during a comprehensive inspection of the Thunder Creek Bridge, a 60-foot steel suspension bridge crossing Thunder Creek at approximately 3,800 feet elevation in one of the most remote sections of North Cascades National Park. The bridge provides the only crossing point for the Thunder Creek Trail, which extends 19 miles into wilderness areas that receive minimal visitation due to difficult access and challenging terrain. Trail bridge inspections require detailed structural assessment, including cable tension measurements, deck integrity verification, and anchor point evaluation. I conduct these inspections overnight to minimize disruption to the small number of backpackers who use these remote trails during summer months. I hiked to Thunder Creek Bridge around 7 p.m., arriving at the structure as daylight faded. The bridge crosses Thunder Creek approximately 40 feet above the water, spanning a narrow gorge in dense old-growth forest. Weather conditions were calm and clear, typical late summer evening in the North Cascades. I established my inspection base camp on the western approach to the bridge and began standard protocols for overnight structural assessment. This involved measuring cable tensions using specialized equipment, testing deck boards for rot or damage, and examining the 4 main anchor points that secure the suspension system to bedrock on both sides of the gorge. Around 11 p.m., while conducting cable tension measurements at the bridge's midpoint, I heard something that made me stop working immediately. From somewhere in the forest around the bridge came a sound I'd never encountered in 11 years of North Cascades trail work. A voice calling my name with perfect clarity from multiple directions simultaneously. Not echoes, not wildlife mimicry, not other hikers. Multiple distinct voices, all saying Ambrose with identical pronunciation and timing, coming from different locations in the surrounding forest, all at once. I've worked these mountains for over a decade. I know wildlife sounds, acoustic phenomena caused by terrain, how human voices carry in different environments. What I heard was impossible, the same voice speaking from perhaps 6 or 7 different locations simultaneously, calling my name with awareness of who I was. The voices continued for approximately 8 minutes, always calling Ambrose in identical timing from different forest locations, sometimes from across the gorge, sometimes from upstream along Thunder Creek, sometimes from the steep slopes above the bridge, but always simultaneously, always identical in tone and pronunciation. I tried responding, calling out to identify who was speaking and where they were located. The voices never acknowledged my responses. They simply continued calling my name every 30 to 40 seconds, each occurrence coming from multiple locations at once. Around 11:15 p.m., the voices stopped abruptly. Complete silence except for Thunder Creek flowing through the gorge below. I resumed bridge inspection work, but remained extremely alert to any sounds from the surrounding forest. Then at midnight, something even stranger occurred. While I was examining the eastern anchor point, I heard a conversation. Not voices calling my name, a detailed conversation between what sounded like 3 or 4 people discussing trail conditions, weather patterns, and camping locations in the North Cascades. The conversation was happening in multiple locations simultaneously. The same voices having the same discussion, but coming from different points in the forest all at once. Not echoes. The words were perfectly synchronized, as if the same conversation was being broadcast from several speakers positioned around the bridge simultaneously. The conversation lasted approximately 12 minutes and included specific details about North Cascades trails, including accurate descriptions of Thunder Creek trail conditions, correct information about camping regulations, and knowledgeable discussion of weather patterns, typical for this area. But the speakers were in multiple locations at once, their voices coming from positions separated by hundreds of feet, but speaking in perfect synchronization. I documented everything using my audio recording equipment. The recordings captured both the voices calling my name and the synchronized conversation, confirming what I'd heard wasn't auditory hallucination or misinterpretation of natural sounds. When I completed my inspection and hiked out the following morning, I filed detailed incident reports with North Cascades National Park, including my audio recordings. Park management reviewed the evidence with concern and confusion. The audio analysis was particularly troubling. Sound engineers confirmed the recordings showed human voices speaking from multiple locations simultaneously with synchronization that shouldn't be acoustically possible. Sound doesn't propagate that way. Voices can't originate from separate locations and maintain perfect timing without technological amplification and coordination systems. Yet my recordings documented exactly that phenomenon occurring in remote wilderness where no such technology existed. I contacted other trail maintenance workers who conduct overnight inspections in remote North Cascades locations. Two admitted they'd heard strange vocal phenomena during night work, voices that seemed to come from impossible locations, conversations that appeared to involve more speakers than could reasonably be present in isolated wilderness areas. One trail worker described hearing what sounded like a large group of hikers having a party somewhere near a remote bridge. But when he investigated with his headlamp, he found no one and the voices stopped immediately. Another inspector reported hearing someone calling for help from multiple directions simultaneously during overnight bridge work. But searches found no distressed hikers and no explanation for voices coming from several locations at once. Thunder Creek Bridge crosses a gorge at 3,800 feet elevation in wilderness, accessed by 19 miles of difficult trail, surrounded by old-growth forest and steep terrain that has remained largely unchanged since before human trail construction. Perfect environment for acoustic phenomena that exceed normal sound propagation physics. And based on what I documented that August night and audio analysis of my recordings, something does exist at certain North Cascades trail bridges that enables voices to speak from multiple locations simultaneously with impossible synchronization that creates acoustic conditions where the same sound can originate from separate positions while maintaining perfect timing. And that made it clear through documented audio evidence that wilderness locations where human infrastructure crosses natural features may develop acoustic properties, allowing sound to propagate in ways that challenge fundamental understanding of how voices travel, echo, and reach human perception in remote mountain environments. My name is Ferdinand Ashcroft. I am 51 years old, and I've worked avalanche forecasting and control for Stevens Pass Ski Resort for 27 years, specializing in pre-dawn avalanche mitigation operations on the Washington Cascade slopes that receive some of the heaviest snowfall in the continental United States. This happened last January during routine pre-dawn avalanche control work. Stevens Pass receives an average of over 460 inches of annual snowfall, requiring extensive avalanche mitigation before the ski area opens to the public. My work involves pre-dawn assessment of avalanche danger zones, deployment of explosive charges to trigger controlled avalanches, and verification that slopes are safe before lift operations begin. This particular morning, I reported to the avalanche control building at 4 a.m. to prepare for standard explosive deployment on upper mountain avalanche start zones. Weather conditions showed heavy overnight snowfall, with approximately 18 inches of new snow accumulation in the previous 12 hours, conditions requiring significant avalanche control work before the mountain could safely open. I coordinated with two other avalanche control specialists, and we proceeded to the upper mountain via snowcat, carrying explosive charges and deployment equipment to designated avalanche start zones above 5,400 feet elevation. Our plan involved triggering avalanches in 6 specific zones known for instability after heavy snowfall events. We reached our first deployment location around 5:15 a.m. The slope appeared typical for post-storm conditions. Deep new snow on established base, moderate wind loading, and terrain features that concentrate snow accumulation in avalanche-prone patterns. I placed the first explosive charge according to standard protocols, verified safe positioning, initiated the timing mechanism, and retreated to our designated safe observation point, approximately 300 yards from the blast site. The charge detonated at 5:23 a.m. with expected force. But what happened next defied every principle of snow physics and avalanche behavior I'd learned in 27 years of mountain safety work. The avalanche didn't descend. The snow displaced by the explosion moved uphill. Not a small amount of snow, not surface snow, caught by wind. A massive avalanche flow containing thousands of cubic yards of snow moved up the slope away from the valley. defying gravity, climbing approximately 200 vertical feet before dissipating near the ridgeline above our blast location. I've witnessed thousands of avalanches triggered by explosive control work. Snow always moves downhill following gravity, always follows the fall line, always deposits in valley terrain below the starting zone. What I observed violated fundamental physics that governs how mass moves on slopes. My two colleagues witnessed the same impossible event. We stood in our safe zone watching snow flow uphill, with the same speed and power avalanches normally descend, but moving in the wrong direction, climbing terrain that should be impossible for flowing snow to ascend. We immediately radioed Ski Patrol Base to report the anomaly and request guidance. Ski Patrol management instructed us to document what we'd observed, but postponed further explosive deployment until the situation could be analyzed. Over the next hour, we placed and detonated 2 additional charges in different avalanche zones. Both produced the same impossible result: avalanches that flowed uphill instead of descending, moving against gravity with significant force and volume before dissipating at higher elevations. By 7 a.m., we documented 3 separate avalanches that had moved uphill on 3 different slopes. Our observation photos and video footage confirmed snow flow moving up terrain with characteristics matching downhill avalanche movement, but in the impossible direction. Stevens Pass management temporarily suspended all avalanche control operations and contacted avalanche forecasting experts from the Northwest Weather and Avalanche Center. The documentation we'd provided was analyzed by specialists who had decades of experience with Cascade Mountain snow physics. Their response confirmed our observations were impossible, according to established avalanche science. Snow doesn't flow uphill. Gravity governs mass movement on slopes. Avalanches follow predictable downhill paths determined by terrain, snow properties, and physical forces. What we documented violated fundamental principles that have governed avalanche forecasting and control work for the entire history of the field. Yet, our photographic and video evidence was undeniable. 3 separate avalanches had flowed uphill with significant volume and force, moving against gravity in ways that challenged basic physics. Stevens Pass receives over 460 inches of average annual snowfall and conducts extensive avalanche control operations throughout winter seasons, creating thousands of observations of how snow behaves under explosive, triggering in varied terrain and conditions. Perfect environment for occasional events that challenge fundamental avalanche physics. And based on what I and my colleagues documented that January morning, something does exist at Stevens Pass that can cause avalanches to flow uphill, that temporarily suspends gravity's governance of mass movement on mountain slopes, and that demonstrated through 3 separate documented events that snow in the Cascade may possess properties enabling it to move against gravity under specific conditions, challenging avalanche forecasting principles that assume gravity will always govern how displaced snow moves on mountain terrain during controlled avalanche mitigation operations.